Всем привет! Я рад вас приветствовать на своем
Good
канале.
morning, everyone. I'm very
И
happy to
сегодня
see you.
пейдж
And
Object MVC с
I will tell you
использованием
about the
.NET.
page object to
Пока все понятно,
MVC
что есть
transfer using the
.NET, но давайте
.NET.
знакомиться.
Let
Меня
me
зовут
introduce
Игорь
myself.
Ershov,
My name
есть
is Igor
компания
Ershov
Kaluga
I
Astral,
introduced the
в
company
которой я
Kaluga
являюсь
Astral,
на
where
текущий момент
I'm currently
руководителем
the
проекта.
project manager.
Недавно я буквально на днях
Recently,
выступал в роли
I performed here
инженера-автоматизатора,
as the automator,
и сегодня я хочу
automate
поделиться с
engineer, automate
вами
engineer.
своим
Now I
опытом
want to share
построения
with you my
проектов
experience of
автоматизации с использованием .NET.
handling the automation
Любой, кто
project using the
занимался
.NET.
автоматизацией
Everyone who
тестирования, знает, что
used
программно
the
построить проект
automation of
автоматизации — это
test and
такой же
automation
самостоятельный
project
проект, как то, что будет
understands very
тестировать с
well
помощью него. Поэтому
there's a well
всегда хотелось бы
constructed,
иметь под рукой
well
такой
approached project
инструмент,
of
с
this
помощью
kind
которого мы могли бы
is
реализовывать подобную платформу
something that works
автоматизации
on its
без
own.
каких-либо
So I would like
дополнительных
to
грузозатрат.
use as much
В идеальном мире, наверное,
effort as
так
possible to
поступать
run such
нельзя.
project. Ideally, there exists
Но мы
such
живем в реальности,
project, but we
и живем в
live in
реальности
a real world,
заставляет
and
нас
it
рассматривать
makes
каждый
us
новый проект автоматизации
I
как
look at
отдельный
every
самостоятельный
automation project
проект
as a
с их
separate automation
особенностями, своими
project with
проблемами
their own
и задачами.
particularities and
И,
tasks that we need
как
to tackle.
кажется нам, мы нашли подобное
We think
решение,
we found
которое
the solution we needed
минимизирует наши
that
трудозатраты
minimizes
и
our
позволяет
efforts
максимально выровнять маржи
and allows us
при
in a
имени
minimum to
поднять проект по автоматизации.
launch the project, automation project,
Рассказывая о нашем
in
решении,
the
прежде
minimum amount of
всего
time.
поговорим о задачах,
First of all,
которые нам
we'll
необходимо было
speak about the
решить, о
task
тех
we needed
проблемах, с
to
которыми мы
handle and the
сталкивались,
problems we faced,
о том, как мы
about
поняли,
how
что
we
первый вылет
understood that
стал комом,
the
как мы
first
перешли на
install
совершенно новую платформу и внедрили
very
MVC
can
тесты,
be a problem.
как
How we
мы
move to a different
применяли
platform and
и,
we introduce the
собственно,
MVC
что
test, how
такое микротесты
or the
и как мы с
microtests
вами
are,
знакомы.
and how we
Давайте
arrange
начнем.
everything. I think we should start.
Прежде чем рассказывать о
Before
задачах,
I tell you about our
которые
tasks,
нам
the
необходимо было
goals,
решить, я
then we had
познакомлю
it to
вас с
tackle,
первым проектом,
I will
который
tell you about our
подразумевался
first
автоматизацией.
project
Это
that was
было
subject to
приложение,
automation. It
написанное на
was an
языке
app
C-Sharp
written in
с
C-sharp
использованием
language using the
элементов с
interface
использованием платформы
UI
Windows
elements
Forms
and
и элементов
Windows
интерфейса от
Forms
компании DevExpress.
and Express user
И
interface
до нашего первого
elements.
решения по
Before
внедрению
our first
автоматизации уже
solution
предпринимались
decision to
какие-либо
introduce
попытки,
automation, there were
которые не
some
увенчались
attempts
успехом.
that were not
И
successful.
стоит отметить, что
It
проект
is worth
находится в
noting that
релизе
the project
достаточно
has
давно,
been in the release
и
phase for a long
революционный
time,
цикл
and the
тестирования
regression
занимал порядком
testing
20
cycle
часов
took over
работы команды тестирования.
20
В связи с этим
hours of the
невозможно
testing
было
team.
проводить
Thus, it
быстрые
was
частые
impossible to
релизы, и
conduct
это
two
являлось большой проблемой для
uh,
проекта.
releases
Поэтому
and
было
release
принято
them often.
решение внедрять
Therefore, we decided to
автоматизацию,
introduce
которая
automation,
подразумевала именно
which means
автоматизированный
using
регрессионное
automated
тестирование.
regression
И
testing.
вначале мы решили
At the very
разделить
beginning, we
высокую
decided
уровневую
to
логику в тестах,
uh,
сами тесты и
separate
данные, с
the
которыми мы будем
low
работать.
level
И по выбору
logic and the
языка
tests.
разработки
When we,
мы много
while
вариантов
selecting
рассматривали, но пришли к
the
решению, что
testing
нужно использовать
language,
именно C-Sharp,
we
потому что
decided
это
to
основной язык для
s-
разработки
uh,
программного обеспечения в компании.
we use the C-sharp language as the main language of
И
development
стоит
in the
отметить,
company.
что раз
It is worth
приложение
noting
находится в
since
релизе достаточно давно,
the application has been in the
каких-либо
release phase for a long
заметок на
time,
автоматизацию в нем
there
не
are
было. И
no
поэтому мы приняли решение,
uh,
что будем проводить автоматизированное тестирование через
elements of
пользовательский
automation before.
интерфейс
We
с
decided to use the
использованием
interface, user
решения от
interface
компании Microsoft
using the
или
Microsoft
Petersburg
solution
Test.
called
И начали мы сталкиваться с проблемами, как
uh,
только
testing. We came
находили
across a
попытки
number
в
of
реализации. Итак, первая
problems,
проблема была формат
of which the
тестовых
first
данных,
one
как
was
их,
that the
собственно,
testing
готовить.
data format.
Наша основная задача
We need to
стояла в том,
understand how to
чтобы
prepare it.
отделять
Well, major
тестовые
task was to
данные самих
separate the
тестов
testing
и
data from the
чтобы
test
группа
in order
тестирования
to
могла их
for
менять
for
самостоятельно,
the testing
без
group to
изменения
amend them
чего-либо в
separately
проекте.
without changing anything in the project.
Тестовые данные у нас
The test
состояли не
data
только из
included not
метаданных,
only the
которые были необходимы
metadata
для установки
that were
каких-либо
necessary to
параметров в
install
системе,
certain
но и из
parameters in the
дополнительных
system, but
тестовых
also
данных,
additional
которые
testing
также
data
выступали в
that were
качестве этих
also
параметров. Но данную
acting
проблему
as
мы
parameters.
решили с
We solved this
использованием
problem using
собственных конфигов в
our own
формате
configs in the form
XML и JSON. Почему
XML
именно
and
эти
JSON
форматы?
formats. Why did we
Поскольку
choose
проектная
this
команда постоянно работает с
format?
подобными типами
Since
данных,
the
им
project team
оказалось
constantly works with
достаточно
this kind of
легко
data,
переключиться
it was
и
much
использовать
easier for them to
другой
switch
вариант
to this
оформления тестовых данных.
way
Как
of
логировать тесты? Проблема
presenting
стала
testing
перед нами
data.
очень
How
острой
to log the
после
test.
первого
This problem
же
became
прогона наших тестовых
very
команд.
acute
Получили
when we
огромный
ran the
картину,
first test
огромный
for the
код, в
first
котором
time. We
никто не
received
мог разобраться.
a
Ложь
big
это
picture of
выглядело вот так.
code which looked like this, a
На
log
рынке есть достаточно
in the
большое
logged
количество систем
files,
логирования,
and the
но
market
большая часть из
presents
них нам
provides a
не
big
подходила
number of
по
login
установленному
tests,
функционалу
but we
и работала
could not
исключительно
use
на
majority
Java
of
платформе.
them.
Вполне возможно,
because we used the Java platform.
они там
Of course,
искали.
maybe we're not looking
Но
in the way,
проблема
in
являлась
the
очень
right
серьезной, и
place, but the
поэтому
problem
принималось
was
решение
very
между тем,
serious and
чтобы
decided
переискать
where
собственную платформу,
we
которая
should
будет
write
логировать,
our
или
own
взять все-таки
problem
что-то готовое.
platform that will log the data,
В
or
одном из
use
докладов
the ready-made solution.
коллег
In one
по цеху тестирования мы
of our
нашли
colleagues'
интересный момент, то что
reports,
тесты необходимо
we found a
оформлять
solution
следующим
that we
образом,
need
что у нас
to use
наш
the
тест
following
представлял
reporting
собой набор из
procedures so
пяти-либо
that our test would
сценариев
look like a
и
set a
пяти-либо
number of
интерфейсов.
scenarios, a number of
Каждый кейс у
cases.
нас будет представлять
Every
отдельный
case
метод,
would look
который
like
будет
a
назван
separate method
соответствующим образом,
that would be
чтобы
presented in a
потом удобно
special way,
отслеживать
so that it would be easier
историю
later to
ошибки
follow
и что вообще
the
происходило.
mistakes and
И мы
errors
нашли готовое
and
решение,
follow what happened.
которое
We found a
выглядело вот
ready-made
так
solution that
и
looked like
помогало
this,
нам, собственно,
which helped
разобраться
us
с
to
тем, что происходило
understand
с нашими
what
тестами.
is
Данное
happening with our
решение,
tests.
оно парсит
This
лог unit
solution is called
установить такой
Pasta
фреймворк
Log
для
Uniter
проведения тестирования.
is a framework for conducting
Идем дальше.
tests.
Следующая проблема у нас
The next
была,
problem that we
как
faced
включать
was
тесты в
how to
пайплайн.
introduce the test into the pipeline.
Проблема, на самом
The
деле,
problem
до сих
is
пор является
still
немного актуальной.
quite
В проекте
topical.
существовал
The
continuous
problem
integration,
had the
но все
continuous
было
integration
хорошо,
element.
если бы
Everything
это
would
был
be
внутренний
fine
проект.
if this was a
Строить выполнение тестов вне
the
проекта достаточно тривиальная задача,
web
но
project.
на десктоп
It's a
тут
trivial
возникают некоторые трудности.
task in this case, but in our
В нашем
case we
же
had some
случае с
problems.
нашим приложением
In
нам
case of
необходимо
our
было
application, we had
портировать
to
свежую сборку
part
на
the
какой-то удаленный ресурс, на
fresh
котором запускать наши тесты.
version,
Собственно, что мы сделали?
fresh
На
build,
базе
and used in
использующейся
this
нашей системы
separate
Continuous
testing project.
Integration
Using our
мы
continuous
добавили
integration system,
управление с помощью систем виртуализации
we added
VMware и SXI.
ESXi and MVR
Добавили некоторую магию.
element. We added some magic to the potion,
И у нас
and
получилась
we
классная портация наших
received the
сборок
great
на наши
portation of our
генерирующиеся
builds
виртуальные
into
машины,
the generated
чего
virtual machines, as a result of
возникла
which
полная эмуляция
we
работы
achieved the full
пользователя и
emulation
интерфейс,
of the
который
user's
пользователь будет работать.
work and user interface that they use.
Идем дальше. И
We
еще одной
we
проблемой стал это доступ
move
к
on. The
элементам
next
интерфейса.
problem was the access to the
Приложение было очень
interface
древним,
elements.
очень
The
старым,
application was very
и
old, as you can
интерфейс,
say,
который там
ancient,
был,
and the
очень
interface that
глубоко
we
вложен.
had
Если посмотреть
was,
на структуру, для того,
if you look
чтобы
at the
подобраться
structure,
к какому-либо
had a
элементу
lot of
в данном
stacks
случае
on it.
текст-филд, нам необходимо
If you
было пройти
need
вот
to
такой
reach the
глубоко
text field, you need to go
контейнер.
deep,
И
following a
код-гейт,
number
который
of
мы
containers,
использовали,
and
не позволял до некоторых элементов добраться, поскольку
the system that we used did not allow us to reach certain elements because it could not reach deep enough.
В конечном итоге
Eventually,
проблема вынудила нас
the
искать
problem
другие решения
forced us to
интеграции
look for
к нашим элементам интерфейсов.
options of
На помощь
reaching
нам
our
пришло
interface
решение от
elements.
компании Smart Beer в
We
виде
used the
фреймворка TestLab,
test-led
который
framework from
позволял
the Smart Bureau
добраться
company, which
ко
allowed
всем
us to go
элементам и
deep enough to
представлял
reach
классный
all the
функционал
elements and
для управления.
provided all the functions for management of our system.
Начнем с того,
We'll
что мы в
start
самом начале использовали.
with what we
Мы
used from the
переработали
very start.
паттерн
We
page
reworked the
object.
page
Page object —
object
это
pattern.
шаблон проектирования,
Page
который
object
нам
is the
позволяет
sample of
отделять
project
логику
and which
выполнения
allow us to
тестов от
separate the test
инфиализации. То есть у нас
run logic from the
представляется в
implementation.
виде отдельных
You
страниц
can
такие
see
либо пейджи,
separate
либо классы, которые
pages
описывают
or
нашу
classes that
структуру
describe our
интерфейса
structure
на
of our
какой-то
user
странице.
interface elements in a certain page.
Почему все-таки мы
Why did we
начали изобретать что-то
started to
новое
invent something
после того,
new?
как мы реализовали
After
наше
we
решение,
implemented our solution, we ran our
провели
solution,
небольшой
we
анализ,
conducted certain
что в итоге получилось,
analysis.
и нашли следующие предпосылки, для чего нам нужно все-таки менять нашу
We
систему.
came
Первым
across the
было
number of
рациональное
prerequisites for the
использование
change of our
ресурсов.
system. First was the
У нас
rational use of
происходила
resources.
инициализация всех объектов,
In the initialization phase of all the
тестовый запуск было очень
object,
много. На каждый новый тестовый
there were
данные,
a lot of
которые
test
проверяли
runs
один и
for
тот же тест, у нас
changes into
все заново
test
инициализировал
data.
и заново
So we had
выделялась
to
память.
reinitialize everything and need to
Выезжало очень много
allocate
ресурсов.
memory, which
Это нужно
add
проверять.
a lot of resources. We need to
Также наши
get
тесты
rid of it.
выполнялись очень долгое
Also,
время,
our test
порядка
ran
6
for a very long time, about 6 to 8 hours. On the screen, you can see
отчет.
a report in the Telegram bot that showed us how much time it took us.
Соответственно, это нас не устраивало, потому что
Consequently,
это сразу
we're not happy with this since it's
проведением быстрых и частых
violated the
релизов.
main
В общем,
task of conducting
и у нас был
releases and
достаточно сложно поддерживаемый код.
would run very often.
Кусочек метода
We use
каждый
this
раз для
code,
каждого нового
which
теста, то есть
was
каждый
used
раз
for
делалась
every
под
test.
инициализацию
We allocated
нового
memory
проекта.
to initialize all these
Если
objects.
рассмотреть это поподробнее, обратите внимание на первую строчку, когда создали
look at the first line where you can see the helper created. This helper uh, turns into a new constructor helper, which initializes every time. This was called for over 10 times for each iteration. Another problem that we face is that our developers didn't want to participate in the project, and nobody really thought that an automator is a developer in the first case, and we were used to solving the problem by preparing our own stuff. So we decided to teach our testers how to automate everything. Developers didn't want to do it because they didn't want the app platform. I didn't want to learn about it. As a result of the long number of attempts to understand what made our developers unhappy, we came to what we call an MVC. MVC is a very popular standard pattern for developers, particularly those who develop web applications. In this case, uh, we usually don't use your solutions in other people's systems. The sample supposes the separation of the app data into three components: view, model, and controller. The model is provides the data that review reacts to, and the controller interprets all the actions of the user. As a result of the processing of this pattern, we receive the following picture. If you look at the screen, you will see the view turned to our test, the model started presenting testing data, each controllers started presenting the processes that communicate this with services and outsource applications. If you look in more detail, the architecture will look like this. The picture, which includes number of service configurations. Let's look at it in more detail. First element is our startup, some startup class that configures all our tests and all our platform in general. We involve outside libraries and the test set, the base class for all the tests that includes all the examples of start class to get access to some container of dependencies that contains all the dependencies for our tests and to adjust tuning in of our test. The services provide for us the link to the interface with the databases without any lines, and the processes of the test data provide to test the data that we expect, the data that we actually can receive to compare it. The first project where we applied this architecture was the web application, where task was to conduct the integration testing in order to cooperate with integration element. We used the Selenium, everybody knows, and we added the page object pattern. Again, we used the page object, of which we used just the information of the structure of the whole page. And the link was downshifted to the service level. As a result of all these manipulations, we quickly launched our project into the release phase and started giving good results. The main problems was the project of the desktop app that I mentioned in the very beginning of my presentation. We also moved it to a different architecture. Test started to be completed within 2 or 3 hours. I must note we didn't use the parallelization in any of the case. The next step was to conduct the component testing of the web application kernel. And with the direct use of our platform, we came across the following problem. The problem was that a big number of microservices needed a big number of data, some classes, models, and
рационально использовать
and it
огромный
was
монолитную
irrational
архитектуру
to use
тестового
this
приложения, поскольку
monolith
в единый момент
architecture
времени
because at some point
просто-напросто
of
нам большая
time
часть этого приложения не нужна.
we didn't uh, we didn't need
Поэтому
major
для
part of
решения
this
этой
application.
проблемы было принято решение
To
разделить
solve
наши
this, we
тесты по
decided to
сервисам
separate our
и
test in terms
перевести
of services
тесты тоже на
and
микросервисную архитектуру,
move the
которую
test
мы
into the
назвали
microservice
в конечном
architecture
итоге
that
микротесты.
we eventually called
Микротесты, которые
microtests,
тестируют
microtests
микросервисы.
that test microservices.
Реализовывалось это все также на C-Sharp, но
We
уже с
used
использованием
C#
платформы
again
.NET Core.
with .NET
И
Core
благодаря
platform.
такому разбиению
And
у
thanks
нас
to such
появилась возможность
distribution,
тестировать
we had an
все
ability to
микросервисы
test all
отдельно,
microservices
формируя их
separately,
совершенно любые
forming
форматы,
various
цепляя
environments,
тестовая
may
среда
it be
в какой-то
test,
одной
production
переписке всего лишь
environment, or whatever,
файл-структуры.
because we need
Все
to head
оставалось
on to
неизменным,
change
и
only configuration
ресурсы стояли
files.
в
All
разрезе
other things
рационально.
remained the same, and resources were
Теперь
used
перейдем
rationally.
к примерам, как все
Now,
это
let me
устроено
cover some
изнутри.
examples,
Собственно,
how it all looks
у
from the
нас
inside.
на текущем примере
As for current
выполняется
example,
конфигурирование самого
we
приложения в
configure the
отношении
application,
как называется, извиняюсь, конфигурирование идет у нас
subscriptions
сервиса
configure.
очередей и его
We
логической
configure the
структуры.
service of
Сервиса.
orders and subscriptions.
На данном этапе у нас
On this
выполняется
stage,
регистрация
you
всех
register
сервисов и
all
рабочих
services
механизмов для тестов.
and processes you need
Также
for tests.
подключаются все
Then you
внешние
switch
зависимости.
on all the
В данном случае у нас
external
используется для
factors.
взаимодействия RabbitMQ.
For here, for example, we use RabbitMQ
И
as
каждый
a
тест
queue
у нас
service. And
представляет
each
собой
service
подобные методы. Это
has
класс,
such methods.
содержащий в себе тестовый сценарий.
A class which has
Сценарий
a
состоит
test
из
scenario.
шагов,
Scenario
и каждый
consists of
шаг
steps,
интерпретирован в
and each
виде
step
метода,
is
который,
interpreted as a
собственно,
method.
используется по той задаче,
A
которую мы
method is
выполняем.
named according to its task.
Применяя такой подход, мы
Using
можем
such an example and approach,
избежать
we
возникновения
can
непонятных
avoid
ситуаций, когда у нас возникла ошибка, и мы не
uncertainties
знаем, в каком
when we
тесте
have
она
a
упала.
mistake and we don't know in what test we have it. Then we check the log and we see that the test was like that and the initial data was like that and the contradictions looked like that.
Для взаимодействия самого теста с сервисом у нас используются уже готовые написанные библиотеки,
We have
которые
libraries
позволяют нам, используя сервис очередей,
that
взаимодействовать
allow us
с
to use the
тестируемым
service of
микросервисом.
queues and to cooperate with
И
testing
как потом
microservice.
эти тесты завернуть в
How
Docker-контейнер
can we
и
bring them all to
запустить?
Docker
Да,
container and launch them?
с микросервисом
Yes,
на
they
одном
function
этапе,
with
в одном
microservices
контейнере
at
и
Docker hubs
тестируются.
in one container and
Реализовывается
test
все
them.
совершенно аналогично обычному
It is all
приложению, которое
implemented
выполняется
thanks
на
to
большой
a
системе
simple
использования
application which
и
is
так
launched
выглядит наш
with the help
Docker-файл
of Dockers.
для теста.
Here is how our Docker
Чуть
file
более
looks
подробно
like.
о
It's a
нем
Docker
будет
file for test. Let me tell you
показан образом,
about Docker
который
file in more details.
готовый функцию
Here
теста.
is a Docker file where we put
Далее у
a
нас
test
создается
ready
образ,
for
в котором
testing.
тест
Then we
будет
have a time
перемещаться
image where the test
в
will move to the working file. Then test will be published in app file. In .NET and .NET Build commands, Dogfile container is a kind of configuration where everything will be brought together. The next block, tests are copied to images and you have an entry point from which the test will be launched. In this case, when we use such a platform for web application, the configuration remains the same. We also switch on processing services and necessary settings for our tests. In our case, we have a database, and we launch the database context for Vortex work. Now, let me show you a case study for web application, how we test document flow. This application is responsible for document flow between the organizations and control bodies. How can we test it? The cycle consists of several steps: file import, loading, signature, and sending. Each step is related to a separate test during the cycle. On the first step, Thanks to the processor of data, we use the method of file loading test. So it will refer to our services that will interact with the user interface. Then we form the actual and expected test data and compare them. Data processor will interact with user interface with low-level services. It looks like that. Our test data is taken, our test data goes to low-level services, and low-level services connect with user interface. Services use public param name path object and use it. Here is how the structure looks like. You have a model, a simple model, which has features, and namely the elements of the interface we are interested in. This is how we associate the features of the model with the elements of the interface. We use X-byte elements, and then we describe the algorithm of element finding. In this case, we use a selector. It looks like that. Such services are responsible for cooperation with user interface and development of relevant data that you receive through user interface. Expected data are formed by processors of test data. At the end of the day, we have a universal test architecture that we tried on several projects, and it became some kind of a silver bullet. We covered the gap in employees because developers now develop test scenarios. They describe it at high-level language, and developers can also test our applications. That's why some of our tasks are delegated. Not one team is working with the test, but the whole product team is working with the test because they develop not only applications but also tests and their support. That's it. Thank you for your attention, and I'm open to your questions. Thank you for your talk. I have two questions about the Dockers and how you use them in your tests. It's a good practice. When you test the Docker image you send to Pro, the same version, but in your presentation you say that you collect new Docker files. So how do you resolve this problem? You test one image, but you upload another image to Doc. And how do you work with microservices? What if your tests are located in Docker image? How do you work with your own microservices? Thank you for your question. Look, we can test it in test environment and production environment. Thank you. Simply because we change simple configurations. In one image, we can test production environment. In another test, we can test environment. What goes to prod will be checked in prod. Realization can be different. You can mock something and create the data you need, on the basis of which you will test an application. But what about parallel tests? Our resources allow us to open a lot of containers at Docker Hub. Microservice usually uses workload. It works under the workload. It's important that functional tests are performed simultaneously, where you can find the simplest problems. When a lot of users refer to a service, where there is a competitive architecture. can you find bugs then? As for the workload test, we have other tests. And in this case, I talked to you about component testing and the testing of one microservice according to its functions. Workload is a different thing. It happens differently in different places, but we deal with that. Okay. Igor, thank you for your presentation. My name is Daniel. I'm from Bank. You talked about the end-to-end testing. Do I understand you correctly? Yes. What about unit and integration tests? Do you have any vision about it? We do the integration for web applications through user interface. I talked to you about components and microservices. As a matter of fact, it's one application in one project. In one case, you check its interface. In other case, you check the microservices. Okay, thank you. Thank you for your talk. My name is Ramil. I'm from Neoflex, Moscow. I have a completely different question. As far as I understand, you have a unit test, and I don't see any end-to-end scenarios. You check microservices and UI separately, but what about their cooperation? I haven't heard anything about it. How can you answer this question? You say that you do end-to-end, but it's actually not like that. I didn't show you the unit testing at all. Of course, developers create their unit test and it lives separately. It's not related to the project. In this case, we have cooperation. We have a project. It is based on microservices. There is a front which lives separately. We test things through user interface, and we have an integration. So we check the application from various sides. We have unit tests. I haven't talked about it. They live separately. We have component testing through microservices that I talked to you about, and there is also UI testing. When it's all brought together, we have a full picture. Okay. I thought that unit testing was all about component testing. You call a UI and you test a minor thing that goes to a microservice. No, when we test UI, we don't send anything. So you just check the form, yeah, and you click the buttons, yes. We go to the database, we take all the data we need. According to the user interface, we compare it all. But how can you test to microservices that work together? We don't test this junction. We test these things separately. Okay, thank you. Hi, thank you for your presentation. I have a question. What if you need data from another microservice? Do you add it to the doc image? You can use mocks and create the data you need. We will not touch other external microservices. We test the activity of one microservice only. Thank you. I have a short but interesting question. Please use a microphone. No mic, no translation. Have you faced any problems related to the transition? You because the platform appeared to be similar to MVC. You can create a basic backbone of tests within 30 minutes. You can take the models from microservice, which is being tested. If it's a cooperation with a database, for example, you usually use a framework. So you can take these models, you can refer to warehouse and take repositories from there. And just take all the startups used by microservice. You just need 30 minutes or 40 minutes to take the database and send the test to the operation. Okay, another question. Do you open one database for all the tests? No, for every microservice they have their own database. But they put it all in the doc image. Yes, we put it all into doc image. Okay. Other questions? Thank you, Igor. for your presentation. As far as I understand, at the low level, the test is supported by developers, but at the high level, by automatizers. Yes. Do you think it's fine in terms of the implementation? Is it profitable if you have a new microservice? How does it happen? When developers do not create a low level, the automatizer cannot start their testing. No. There is no such a notion as automatizer because the whole product team deals with the test. There are specific developers and testers, but they all deal with that. It doesn't matter who starts with that. Developers can create scenarios but leave them open, and testers can then improve them and bring them to life. Okay, I have a question about the processes. When developers deal with that, you have a feature, automatizers have developed a script, for example, then developers write down the low level, or they develop a feature and then send it to automatizers, or how is it taken place? There is no rule. It goes as it goes. Usually for each microservice, there should be a test. It should be implemented. Sometimes there is a delay because for now, for example, there are a lot of microservices in an application, but there are less tests because they have just started the process gradually. Okay, thank you. Hi, thank you for your talk. What is how many new automatizers and developers do you have in your company? As far as I understand, you need some specific knowledge and skills of developing. So your automatizers are more like developers, right? We divided our activity and our work on tests. That's why testers that develop scripts can work on the third level, but developers can be different. Seniors, for example, can also work on tests. It doesn't matter. The qualification, the skills don't really matter because everybody becomes a member of the team and work on the project. Okay. I have a question about the testing mechanism. I don't really understand your point of view. You said that the developers participate in the code writing. So what do auto testers do? They simply write scripts for clicking or what? We do not have such a notion as automatizers at all. We don't have people who deal with automation only. The whole product team deal with it. There are in-house testers, in-house developers. We don't have any automatizers. Everyone participate in the development of tests. Okay, so people who deal with functions can generate auto tests. Yes, it can happen. Then you don't need to train new employees because usually testers have basic knowledge about programming at the basic level, but that allows him or her to develop scenarios at C#, to use mocks and so on, without using additional difficult skills. And developers can create managerial functions, for example. Okay, what about mocks? You have integration with all the external system, not within the framework of microservice. Do you use mock? Yes, we mock what we don't need. Okay, thank you. Do we have any other questions? All right, no questions to Igor. And now it's time for me to give a t-shirt as a prize. I like the first question. I give this prize to you. Thank you. Thank you for your attention, guys. I will be happy to talk to you in the discussion zone. If you want to talk to me,